Welcome everybody to Youthmin 303, week 2, and our first lecture of our Urban Youth Ministry course. This week we'll broaden our understanding of the nature of urban communities and cultures, and we'll begin to explore how the Bible speaks specifically to the urban context. Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7, this is what it says. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in numbers there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. As we begin to look more intentionally about the urban community and the cultures there within, as we begin to explore God's heart for the church in that space, I am reminded of passages of Scripture like here in Jeremiah that speaks to God's desire to see the city prosper. So today in our lecture, I want to give us a chance to think about, what is a city? Who is a city? Why are these characteristics true of the city? Growing up, I remember hearing my mom say, "You are who you hang with." It was meant to be an influence on my life to help me make great choices about whom I would hang with, and I'm sure it worked to some varying degrees. I mean, think about it. It still rings true in my own mind. I am greatly influenced by those I allow to surround me. Well, I think that saying rings true for the city as well. When we think of urban communities, it's been proposed that one of the greatest influences or one of the greatest impacts on a community's culture is the composition of who makes up that community. In other words, our cities are influenced by those we allow to surround our cities, those who make up our community. Let's explore a little bit about why that is. What is a city? Another way of asking that question is, what are some characteristics that tend to be descriptors of a city? Urban communities are often characterized as large, densely populated, and heterogeneous areas. I mean, think about that for a second. They are a place, a specific place. Therefore, space matters. The reality of where we are matters. It is important to the identity of the city where we are. The density matters. Here in my city, in the city of Philadelphia, we have 1.53 million people in our city. We are densely populated. And oftentimes when we describe our urban community or we describe our city, we use descriptors that describe both the place and the people interchangeably. When I say Philadelphia, I may at some point be talking about our city, or I may at the same point be talking about those who make up our city. But even in a large city that is densely populated, we find that there are smaller neighborhoods within that city that are often heterogeneous. They are diverse, but yet they seem to have some things in common. You see, these descriptors are descriptors that include people, place, and resources, both their dwelling place, their workplace, and their place of recreation are all consumed in these terms: urban community, large city. So the what is defined as a space that matters. Urban communities. But the who? Well, as I started off by saying, we tend to surround ourselves with folks that influence us. So as we select those who we allow to influence us and we find ourselves coming together, we find this large city that is very, very diverse, eclectic. And yet we find these pockets within the cities that are much more homogeneous. We tend to neighbor together with folks that we have the way of life in common with. I mean, we understand this, don't we? We think about our communities that we're a part of, not so much the places that we live, but think about the communities that we choose to be a part of. Maybe you're a part of the YMCA, and you join that for a purpose, and you have a homogenous experience with the other folks who have joined there. Nobody joins the Y because they don't want to participate in the pool, the recreation, the gym, or the social activities, right? We're looking for those things, and therefore we're gravitating to this place together. We neighbor, we do life, we live in relational community with folks that we have things in common with. We tend to surround ourselves with folks that we desire to have commonalities in life with. This is true for us in general, but it's also specifically true when we think about our innermost circles. And those are the circles that are within our larger urban communities. When I speak about where I'm from here in the city of Philadelphia, if I'm out of town and visiting someplace further away, I'll say I'm from Philadelphia. But if I encounter someone who is also from Philadelphia, or someone who knows Philadelphia well, saying that I am from Philly is not enough of a descriptor. I need to then define where I'm from within this very large and complex city. This is true for each of our neighborhoods, whether we describe that by zip code, or we describe that by school, or we describe that by rec centers. We have more intimate descriptors that describe where we are or who we are within a larger and more complex city. Why? Because it tells the story of the who within the what. But why? Neighborhoods within our communities are often defined by our identity, our interaction, and our commonality, the things we have in common with one another. Our identity, we will find a lot of folks within smaller circles within a larger urban community will describe their identity. They've taken on characteristics, the urbanisms that are true within their more micro community of the larger macro community. Their interaction within the community is a descriptor for the community itself. Some areas of our city are defined by more intimate spaces that folks find themselves outdoors in often. Other areas of our city might be defined by high traffic spaces. Other areas of our city might be defined as transient spaces. These are all more greater descriptors of micro points within a macro point. Well, that's also true when we speak about commonality, whether that's language, whether that's socioeconomics, whether that's ethnicity. These are all areas in which we find commonality within our community. Now, that doesn't have to be exclusively true, but even when it's not exclusively true, it still offers influence, going back to where we started at. It still offers influence to those around it. And so if we live within a neighborhood in our community that is defined by the food preference of that community, it's not exclusive. You don't have to love that food in order to be in that community, but you will be influenced by that food regardless, because when you want to go out at 5 o'clock to go to dinner, those are the choices that are in your neighborhood. Understanding these realities about the city is really important when we think about how the church is equipped to respond. You know, if the mission of the church is to reach the lost, seeking the prosperity of the city, what does she need to be equipped with in order to reach the lost and to see the city prosper? Well, here's a couple of quick points for us tonight. One, we've got to be in the space. We've got to be permanently affixed in the space. While some areas of our communities may be marked by being transient spaces, the church cannot afford to be one of them. The church cannot move in and move out of the neighborhood. Rather, just like the neighborhood, the church needs to be marked by who surrounds it. Maybe another way to say that is this: as the neighbors transition in and out of the community, and as the community itself shifts because of those neighbors, the church needs to be anchored only to the Word of God. The mechanisms of the church and the methodology of the church needs to be equally as transient as the community that the church is embedded in. We've seen what happens within our cities when the church is not as fluid as the community around it. Those churches have now become apartment buildings, condos, workspaces. The church, in order to continue to be the thriving influence that God has ordained the church to be, the church needs to be fluid and as transient as the community that she finds herself in. Why? Because the church knows what's at stake. We cannot afford to be irrelevant for a decade while the community redefines itself around us. The gospel witness has to be steady and non-ignorable, non-negotiable. It needs to be the influence that redefines the identity of the community while the community is seeking to define its own identity. Maybe I would say it this way: as the church prospers, the city will prosper. Now, when I say prosper, please don't hear me saying something other than as the church thrives, as the church reaches its goal of reaching the lost, as the church begins to reflect the community that continues to evolve around it. It influences that community with the hope of the gospel, with the witness and the proclamation of the good news, with tangible expressions of the gospel gift of Christ's life, death, resurrection, and with hope, a hope that continues to point the city towards thriving as well. This week, I want you to explore how the church has done that with you and for you. We're gonna write out our faith chart. And this is just a quick explanation of what a faith chart is. A faith chart is like a living document that continues to tell the story of how God has shown up each year in your life. You might refer to it as a timeline of the Karens. Karen is an Old Testament phrase that speaks to the pile of rocks that were put in place to monument, to memorialize, to remember something great that God had done right there. Well, as you chart this out, where would you place your pile of rocks each year? What did God do? I'm going to ask you to write a narrative that tells the same story and then give a graphic timeline depicting that story. You might be thinking to yourself, well, God did many things each year. And this is a living document. It might not always say the same thing. You might look back on this 6 months from now and say, you know what? There's something else that I remember from that year that even seems more influential or memorable or important in that moment than what I first thought. But I want to ask you to go ahead and do that this week. Make sure this week you turn in your faith chart, both the narrative and the graphic. Make sure you've gotten through your reading of the Renewing the City. We should be through the first 90 pages of the book at this point. And make sure you watch the other 2 presentations that are here with accompanying this link as well. These 3 presentations should set us up to be able to understand more fully the nature of our urban communities and the cultures that they represent. And it should equip us to begin to explore what does the Bible say about urban context, God's heart for the urban space, and our call there as well. So at the end of this week, please make sure you've handed in all of these things. Make sure you post your article and make sure you respond to someone else's article. And let me just say this really quickly. We should be maturing each week in our work. And so while last week's assignments were done and done well, we'd like to see this week growing on that, a more in-depth look at these articles that you're posting and a more in-depth intentional response to those articles. Friends, I'm so excited for us to be on this journey through urban youth ministry together. I hope this lecture finds you well, and I can't wait to see how you respond. God bless you.